Imagine waking up tomorrow and the year is 1962. You remember falling asleep in 1919. You remember the smell of the kitchen, your mother's voice, the newspaper headline on the table. And then nothing. No dreams. No awareness of time passing. Just a gap where 43 years of your life should have been. Your body is old, your mind is not. And no one can explain what happened to you. This was not a nightmare. This was the reality for thousands of human beings. People who closed their eyes during one of the most turbulent decades in modern history and did not come back until the world they knew was already buried in the past. We are told this was a disease. We are told it was mysterious, unfortunate, and ultimately unimportant. We are told it has been explained. It has not. To understand what happened, you have to understand the world these people were living in. By 1916, the planet was being pulled apart and reassembled at a pace that had no historical parallel. The First World War had turned European civilization into an industrial killing machine. Factories ran without pause. Laboratories were drafted into warfare. Chemistry, electricity, and mechanical engineering were no longer sciences. They were weapons. And into this already fractured world, something new began. Not explosions, not revolution, something far quieter. People started to slow down. At first, the reports trickled in from clinics in Vienna and Paris. Patients arriving with exhaustion, unlike anything physicians had seen. Not the tiredness of illness or malnutrition, but a heaviness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper. Then came the strange motor symptoms. Tremors, rigidity, involuntary movements that would start and without stop cause, and then one by one, they descended into sleep. Not ordinary sleep. Doctors struggled immediately to find language for what they were observing. The body continued to function. The heart beat, the lungs drew breath, but the person, the will, the animation, the essential aliveness appeared to have withdrawn. Somewhere unreachable by 1917. The same reports were arriving from Germany, England, Russia, Italy. By 1918, hospitals across the eastern United States were filling with patients who displayed the identical constellation of symptoms. The condition was eventually classified as encephalitis lethargica, an inflammation of the brain, named for its most visible feature, profound, unrelenting sleepiness. But even the doctors who coined the diagnosis admitted in private that the label did not truly fit. There was no consistent fever, no reliable evidence of infection, and the progression of the illness refused to behave the way inflammations behave. By 1919, conservative estimates suggested over 1 million people across multiple continents had been affected. Some researchers believed the true number was considerably higher, suppressed by wartime censorship, poor record keeping, and a medical establishment already overwhelmed with casualties. The world filed it under tragic and inexplicable and moved on. Here's where the official story begins to come apart. A disease spreads. It moves from host to host along traceable paths. It has an origin point, an incubation period, and a pattern of transmission that, even when complex, eventually yields to investigation. The sleeping sickness did none of this. Outbreaks appeared across entire districts, with no identifiable patient. 0 clusters of cases emerged simultaneously. In people who had never shared a room, a building, or even a neighborhood. Transmission timelines were erratic or non-existent. Doctors quietly noted in their journals that they could not trace how the condition was moving. And then, with remarkable consistency, they moved on to the next observation without dwelling on the implications of that admission. The symptoms themselves presented a second layer of impossibility. These were not patients behaving like infection victims. Many of them were locked, rigid muscles holding unnatural postures for months, sometimes years. Others experienced hijacked motor systems, facial tics, repetitive movements, involuntary rhythms that ran on some circuit, entirely separate from conscious control. And then there were the ones who appeared awake, but unreachable eyes tracking movement. Tears forming in response to emotional stimuli, fear visible on faces that could not speak or move voluntarily. This was not unconsciousness. Something aware was present behind those faces, something that could perceive, but could no longer act. A third anomaly surfaces in duration. Most neurological conditions have a trajectory. They worsen, stabilize, or resolve. What they do not do is hold a patient frozen and neurologically preserved for 3 or 4 decades. Inflammation destroys tissue over time. Degeneration progresses. Yet thousands of sleeping sickness patients remained in essentially unchanged states for the length of entire adult lifetimes, their brains neither recovering nor deteriorating, simply suspended. Then there's the matter of what happened when some of these patients were experimentally awakened. Decades later, in the late 1960s, physicians administering dopamine-based treatments witnessed something that should have rewritten the medical literature. Patients who had been institutionalized since the 1920s suddenly spoke, stood, laughed, wept. Their memories were intact, their personalities unchanged. Their last conscious moment, in many cases, was a specific day during or shortly after the First World War, and to them, almost no time had separated that day from the moment they opened their eyes. 40 years had passed to them. It was as if someone had simply reached over and pressed pause. No known disease does this. Finally, consider the geography of the epidemic. Rural areas were largely untouched. The hardest hit populations were children, young adults, soldiers, and urban industrial workers. This distribution does not align with known viral behavior. It does not follow population density alone. It follows with uncomfortable precision. Environments undergoing the most intense technological and industrial transformation. When you lay all of these threads side by side, something begins to take shape. Not a disease, a response. By 1916, the human nervous system was operating inside an environment it had never encountered before and had not evolved to navigate. Electrical grids were expanding rapidly across major cities. Radio transmission, still experimental at the war's start, was operational, and proliferating chemical agents, some of the most toxic compounds ever deliberately released, were dispersing into air, water, and soil across whole regions of Europe. Industrial machinery ran day and night, filling urban environments with noise, vibration, and emissions without precedent. And layered beneath all of this was mass psychological trauma on a scale that had no modern equivalent. The brain regions, most specifically damaged in encephalitis lethargica, patients were not distributed randomly. Post-mortem examinations identified concentrated damage in the midbrain, basal ganglia, and brainstem, structures responsible for regulating the transition between sleep and wakefulness, for initiating voluntary movement, and for sustaining, motivated, engaged behavior. These are among the most ancient and fundamental regulatory systems in the human brain. They are also critically highly sensitive to disruption. What happens when those systems are overwhelmed? Modern neuroscience has documented shutdown responses in individuals subjected to extreme trauma. Soldiers freeze, survivors dissociate. Consciousness narrows and withdraws to protect the organism from stimuli it cannot process. These are recognized, documented responses, protective, not pathological. The sleeping sickness appears to have been this response at population scale. Consider the geographic and demographic pattern again. Urban, industrial workers were disproportionately affected. People whose nervous systems were immersed most completely in the new environment. Soldiers stationed near artillery lines, communications equipment, and chemical deployment zones showed elevated incidence. Children whose neural architecture was still forming were particularly vulnerable. Those living outside the reach of industrialization were largely spared. This is not the pattern of contagion. This is the pattern of exposure. The awakenings, too, more sense through this lens. Dopamine treatments did not cure these patients. They temporarily overrode a suppression. They forced shutdown circuits back online briefly. Before the underlying mechanism reasserted itself, the brain remembered the threat and reinstated its defense. This is not how recovery from disease works. This is how a circuit breaker behaves when you try to reset it before the overload has been resolved. The epidemic also ended in a way that no disease ends. It did not burn out. It did not mutate and resurface. It simply ceased, declining sharply as the post-war world stabilized, as certain chemical agents were regulated, as the most extreme period of technological shock began to normalize. The overwhelming convergence of environmental stressors that had defined 1916 to 1922 was not replicated, and without those conditions, the response did not recur. No global commission was ever convened to investigate the sleeping sickness. No coordinated international research effort comparable to those launched for other mass casualty events was ever initiated. The world's medical establishment accepted the mystery, published the case studies, and waited for the phenomenon to resolve itself, which eventually it did. The patients did not. Thousands of them remained in institutional care for decades, maintained by staff who largely assumed they were unaware of their surroundings. The awakenings proved otherwise. Many of these individuals had been conscious throughout, present, but paralyzed, watching time pass from a fixed point inside a body that would not respond. History quietly erased them. The question worth asking is why, not as accusation, but as inquiry. Because the pattern of erasure follows a recognizable logic, acknowledging that consciousness could be suppressed by environmental conditions, by the byproducts of industrialization, by electromagnetic fields, by chemical saturation, by neurological overload, would have forced a reckoning that no government or institution was positioned to conduct. In the 1920s, progress had to continue. War economies had to be rebuilt. Acknowledging systemic neurological costs was not something any authority was prepared to do. So the epidemic was medicalized, reduced, and eventually forgotten. Not deliberately conspired into obscurity, simply deprioritized, until the silence filled in naturally around it. The sleeping sickness is not just a historical curiosity. It is a demonstration that human consciousness has operational limits, that the relationship between mind and environment is not passive. When that environment changes beyond a certain threshold, the mind does not necessarily break loudly. Sometimes it goes quiet. We inhabit a world in 2024 that is more neurologically demanding than anything imagined in 1916. Chronic overstimulation, inflammation saturation, ambient electromagnetic exposure, compounding psychological pressures. The external conditions have grown more complex, not less. The exact catastrophic convergence of 1916 has not been repeated, but the underlying principle